Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. The entire history of voter suppression in America can be summed up in a quote that is more than a century old. A former Alabama congressman, Frederick Bromberg, said in 1909, "We have always, as you know, falsely pretended that our main purpose was to exclude the ignorant vote, when, in fact, we were trying to exclude not the ignorant vote, but the Negro vote." That quote was first brought to my attention by a writer who is one of the foremost experts on voting rights and voter suppression in the United States today. He's our guest this week, Ari Berman, the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. He is also a senior reporter at Mother Jones Magazine. Ari, welcome.
Good to see you again, Bob.
Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. So bring us up to date. What are the latest important developments regarding voting rights and voter suppression?
So just to give the big picture first, since the 2010 election, when so many states flipped from red to blue to red or became a whole lot redder, 22 states have passed new restrictions on voting. So those range from strict voter ID laws to cutbacks to early voting to changes that make it more difficult to register to vote, to closing polling places, to disenfranchising ex-offenders. It's not one thing, it's a whole strategy. That strategy has intensified with the Trump administration. We now have Jeff Sessions, one of the most foremost opponents of civil rights, as Attorney General. The Justice Department has already reversed the Obama administration's positions in key Supreme Court cases. We now have this quote-unquote election integrity commission led by Vice President Mike Pence, but more importantly, the vice chair is the Kansas Secretary of State Kris Kobach, who's one of the leading figures in the Republican Party when it comes to restricting voting rights, has passed a whole host of voter suppression measures. So that's what's happening at the federal level. We have a hostile Justice Department, we have a hostile presidential commission. At the state level, more and more new restrictions on voting are being passed with almost no attention. In 2017, there's been more new restrictions on voting passed than in 2016 and 2015 combined.
Wow.
So at every level with the Republican Party, we're seeing voter suppression becoming institutionalized, becoming normalized. And that's what really frightens me today.
Now, we can't even talk about irony in this country anymore. It's just outright craziness all over the place. But you mentioned the president's voter integrity commission. It gives me a headache just to think about it, but explain what that is, why it was created, and what it's supposed to do.
I think it's really important to note that this entire commission is premised on a gigantic lie, which is that President Trump said 3 to 5 million people voted illegally after he lost the popular vote. He got up one day, he started tweeting, "I would have won the popular vote if not for the millions of people that voted illegally." He said he would present the evidence. He never presented the evidence because there was no evidence to present about mass voter fraud. But that actually led to something. It led to this commission on quote-unquote election integrity that is stacked with some of the worst vote suppressors in the Republican Party. People like Kris Kobach, who have disenfranchised tens of thousands of people in Kansas. People like Ken Blackwell, who was the Ohio Secretary of State in 2004, when there were so many shenanigans in that state. People who worked in the George W. Bush Justice Department, when they basically purged the Justice Department of all the civil rights lawyers there that had been there for decades enforcing civil rights laws. So this is really an all-star team. I hesitate to call it an all-star team, but an all-star team of voter suppression within the Republican Party. And what worries me about this commission is that, number one, they're going to make a lot of false statements about fraud. They've done it in the past, and they'll do it in the future, and that will get highlighted because it's a presidential commission. Members of the media will take it seriously. President Trump might tweet about it. So there'll be this whole narrative about fraud that's completely untrue. Then they'll actually recommend specific policies to make it harder to vote. Policies that have a disproportionate impact on people of color, on younger voters, on poorer voters, on first-time voters, all of which will try to help Donald Trump in the run-up to the 2020 election.
Now, the answer to this question seems obvious to me, but it's not obvious to everybody. A lot of people say, all right, what's the big deal about, for example, voter ID? You have to show ID here, there, and everywhere in this country. So explain why that's a big deal, but also explain why the GOP is so hell-bent on this whole voter suppression campaign year after year.
So that's a really good question, and obviously I encounter that all the time in my reporting, because people say, well, everyone has a driver's license, everyone has a photo ID, what's the big deal? And it's true. For 85 to 90% of the public, voter ID laws specifically are not a big deal. But for the 10 to 15% of the public that doesn't have these strict forms of ID, it can be very burdensome. And that's what the social science literature teaches us, that it is a significant number of people. So take Wisconsin, for example, because there's been a lot of data about Wisconsin. Wisconsin had a strict voter ID law in effect for the first time in the 2016 election. You had to show a Wisconsin driver's license or state ID. So if you moved from Illinois, you couldn't use your Illinois driver's license. So it wasn't just about having ID, it was having specific forms of ID. The federal courts found that 9% of the electorate in Wisconsin, 9% of registered voters did not have strict forms of ID, which is a really big number. We know Donald Trump won the state by only 23,000 votes. A new study just came out by the University of Wisconsin. They asked people who didn't vote, why didn't you cast a ballot? 1 in 10 people said the voter ID law was a reason why, or the main reason why they didn't cast a ballot. So in just 2 counties, in Milwaukee and in Dane County, which is home to Madison, they found up to 23,000 people in those 2 counties alone who might not have voted because of that voter ID law. That was the same margin of victory for Trump. So you see in a state where the numbers are so close how this can have a big impact. And they found that black voters were 2 to 3 times as likely as white voters to not vote because of the voter ID law. We know college students were targeted because they couldn't use their college IDs to be able to vote. So that's just one state. And then you look at other states. In Texas, you can vote with a handgun permit, but not a student ID.
You believe?
So
yes, you can believe it. Of course you can believe it.
So let's say you go to University of Texas. That's a state school. So that's a government-issued ID. But you can't use it. You can use that to board an airplane, to buy cough medicine, to do all these things that people say you need an ID to do it in life. But you can't use it to vote. So I think the way these laws are written and implemented, it's clear they're affecting some people more than others. They're affecting low-income voters, younger voters, people of color, more than reliably white Republican voters. In the bigger picture, I think why Republicans are doing this is because they see the demographics of the country changing. And they see the changing demographics identifying more and more with the Democratic Party. And particularly they saw it identified with the first black president. And they said, we have to do something to stop this, because we're not going to get these votes. We're not going to get these votes by demonizing Black Lives Matter and deporting dreamers and opposing a higher minimum wage and all the things that the changing demographics of the country care about. So if we're not going to get the votes of the changing demographics, can we make it harder for them to participate in the political process in the first place?
And then you combine this campaign for voter suppression, which is already underway and which is already working, with the gerrymandering, which is also in place. So talk about gerrymandering and what it's doing to the democratic process.
I think this is such a huge problem. If you look at what happened in 2012, Democrats got over 1 million more votes for the House of Representatives, but Republicans got 33 more seats in the House because they had gerrymandered so effectively. They won so many state legislatures after the 2010 election. So when the new census came out, they were in control of so many key states, whether it was Ohio or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. They drew the districts to benefit Republicans and to disenfranchise Democrats in terms of representation. And so what these state legislatures did when they took over, pretty much in conjunction, was pass gerrymandered maps and pass new voter suppression laws to make sure that their majorities were protected, both in terms of the composition of districts and also in terms of the composition of the electorate. And so basically we have a situation where the majority party in this country is trying to rule through undemocratic means.
Right. So there are, I mean, this is all, at least from my perspective, this is all bad news. There are people fighting back against voter suppression, gerrymandering, other elements that are undermining the democratic process. Can you talk a little bit about that and talk about who's doing it, what they're doing, and how effective or not effective these efforts are?
That is true. I mean, people are trying to figure out innovative ways to challenge this kind of stuff. One example is there's going to be a big partisan gerrymandering case heard by the Supreme Court, and what people in Wisconsin did, plaintiffs in Wisconsin who are aligned with the Democratic Party, they decided to challenge these gerrymandering maps as a partisan gerrymander. And not to get too technical, but basically what the Supreme Court has said is that if you gerrymander on the basis of race, that's unconstitutional. You can't just draw a district that eliminates every black voter, because that would violate the Voting Rights Act. But you can draw a district that just deprives any Democratic voter of representation, because you say, well, I'm just doing it for partisan reasons, and partisan gerrymandering is as old as the Republic itself. What the challengers in Wisconsin are saying is that partisan gerrymandering should be treated as like racial gerrymandering, which is to say it can be discriminatory and you can deprive people of representation. Republicans can do it to Democrats, and Democrats can also do it to Republicans. And so this is a case in Wisconsin that has far-reaching ramifications in terms of striking down partisan gerrymandering on both sides. Because I'm not for partisan gerrymandering when Democrats do it either.
Nor am I.
Exactly. I want to be
Right.
clear here. I'm for democracy's sake, not because it benefits one party or another. And I know you are as well. And so I think that's one kind of innovative solution. I see other organizations stepping up. I see the ACLU is launching a 50-state voting rights project. People are not just pumping a lot of money into litigation, but they're trying to pump money into organizing as well. Because, the courts are going to be hostile for a while with Trump appointees.
Right.
Jeff Sessions is running the Justice Department. So you really have to try to mobilize and organize people like was done in the 1960s by the Civil Rights Movement. They had very few sympathetic actors, sympathetic allies in the 1960s.
And not that much in the way of sympathetic coverage from the media either, for that matter.
No, it's amazing when you go back and look at the polling, how many people supported literacy tests
Right.
and poll taxes, how many people thought Martin Luther King was a communist. We have this notion of these guys as our national heroes, and they are national
Democratic
heroes.
administration that wiretapped Martin Luther King.
Exactly. We don't realize the unbelievable resistance that the civil rights activists faced back then, but they persevered. And I'm not saying it's the same kind of situation today, because we've obviously made a lot of progress. But when you have so many levels of government stacked against you, you have to start thinking in more non-traditional ways. And I think people are starting to do that.
One of the things I've wondered is why the Democratic Party has not emphasized the importance of voting, the single simplest and one of the most effective steps you can do against all the stuff we were talking about in a lot of the other complaints that Democratic voters have. If, for example, the Democrats could take just one house of Congress, they could stop much of the things that people are complaining about with regard to the Trump administration. Can you talk about the importance of voting and why you think there hasn't been more of an effort to turn out much larger numbers of Democratic voters?
I think that's a really good point. I think first off, when all of these voter suppression laws were passed, the Democratic Party was just totally caught off guard. They didn't know what to do about it. They didn't know how to challenge it. They didn't know how to message about it. Now I think they're still worried that when you talk about voter suppression, that's going to dissuade people from voting. But I think that's a mistake, because I think you really have to challenge these laws affirmatively so people know what's going on. And I think the Democrats have an opportunity here to say one party is making it harder for you to vote, which shows how important your vote is, right?
Exactly.
Because people wouldn't be passing voter suppression laws if they didn't believe that the vote itself had power.
Right.
And so I think it's really important for the Democratic Party to emphasize this more. I think the Democratic Party needs to focus more on its core constituents. We've heard so much talk about the white working class.
You're anticipating a question of mine. Go ahead.
After the election. And the white working class is tremendously important, but you know what's also important? The black working class, the Latino working class, young people. This is the core of the Democratic Party's base, single women. And just to turn your back on them, I think would be a huge mistake. The demographics are on the Democrat side. That is their greatest strength, is the changing demographics of the country. That's in fact why Republicans are passing these new voter suppression laws. And I think, if Democrats have a strategy following Trump that they're just going to try to court the white working class, they're just going to try to court voters in the middle, they're going to turn their back on their own base, I think that would be a really big mistake. And I think it would really cede one of the greatest advantages that they have. I think Republicans, what they've done is the minute they take power, they think about how can we institutionally strengthen our power through voter suppression, through gerrymandering, by going after unions, by courting big money, all of these things. Democrats don't think, what can we do to strengthen and build our own base and get them motivated? I think there needs to be a lot more of an effort in thinking about how to do that.
And, it's funny, the Democrats have been taking a great deal of criticism from Republicans and from others, and in fact, from a lot of Democrats doing postmortems on the presidential election about focusing on these individual groups, this so-called identity politics that Democrats are accused of doing. And that seems so strange to me, because it seems to me if there's one party in this country that's been focused on identity politics, it's the Republicans. Can you talk about that a little bit? This is an almost all-white party.
It really is astounding to me that basically the Republicans have an identity politics. It's the politics of whiteness. I mean, that's exactly what Donald Trump's entire campaign was about. When he called Mexicans rapists and murderers, when he went to Detroit and told African Americans, your life is so terrible, what do you have to lose? This was all about identity politics. It was about the identity politics of appealing to the white conservative backlash vote.
Right.
The same vote that George Wallace, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan all successfully courted. That's what Donald Trump was going for. But when Democrats try to appeal to African Americans or Latinos or college students, it's somehow identity politics, that they're playing the race card, that they're trying to divide people based on identity and culture. And I think that's absolutely ridiculous. I think one party is trying to pursue a purely white nationalist identity. The other party is trying to pursue a multicultural identity that reflects the country we live in today.
Right.
And the thing that's frustrating to me is it's not just Republicans who are saying this. You now have liberal academics that are accusing
exactly right. Yeah.
That are accusing Democrats of playing this so-called identity card. They didn't say that when Barack Obama was a successful two-term African-American president, but they said it the minute Hillary Clinton lost the Electoral College to Donald Trump. And I think there's a lot of stuff that the Clinton campaign should have done differently. But I mean, you just look at the numbers. If black voter turnout was up in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that was the election right there. So while the white working class is important, if Democrats had just done a better job of getting their own voters to the polls, Hillary Clinton would be president right now.
Both parties are afraid of appealing in what they think of as too strong a way for black votes. And it has always been this way. I mean, even Barack Obama he didn't have to do much to build up the African-American vote, obviously. But even he was afraid of being thought of as appealing too directly to African-American votes. And I remember as far back as when David Dinkins was the mayor of New York, in his bid for a second term, when he got defeated by Rudy Giuliani, if the African-American turnout had been just the same as it had been in the first term, he would have defeated Giuliani. And yet that lesson doesn't seem to have been learned.
Well, I mean, I think, you know this, Bob. Barack Obama could not be seen as an angry black man.
Exactly right.
Michelle Obama could not be seen as an angry black woman. Donald Trump can be the angriest white man in America, which he routinely is, from 7 in the morning when he starts tweeting till the end of the night when he's rewatching Fox and Friends. He's the angriest white man in America. But Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, they can't show that. Hillary Clinton, even as a white woman, couldn't show that same level of outrage. So there's a complete double standard here. The thing I am worried about, though, is that in the 3 elections in the Obama era, when Obama wasn't on the ballot, in 2010, in 2014, and 2016, turnout was down significantly for the Democratic Party. So the worry here is, has this become too much of a cult of personality? Too much of a party centered around President Obama, who is an incredible politician, but when he's not there, his own coalition is not transferable. And I think Democrats have to figure this out very, very quickly, because President Trump tapped into something with this angry white, it's still a minority, but with this angry white base of his. They're there for him. And Democrats have to figure out, are they going to be able to counteract that with their own supporters when Barack Obama's not on the ballot and not even really part of the political landscape in the same way in 2020?
If Democrats feel that the strategy now, given Trump's victory, is that they have to appeal much more to the white working class and significantly less to African Americans or Latinos or young voters, they'll lose because you talked about the demographics. The demographics have changed, and those voters will not turn out if they're not appealed to. So we saw what happened. I mean, Obama got elected in the first term. 2 years later, when the vote fell off a cliff, turnout fell off a cliff, and you lost one house of Congress. Same thing happened, when Obama got reelected. In the next election, they lost the other house of Congress. So it's Democrats are playing with fire if they don't get their heads straight on who they're appealing to and get a message for those voters. In terms of voting, I mean, other societies have larger turnouts in their elections and that sort of thing. What could we do to make it easier to vote? Why shouldn't American citizens, for example, just automatically, based on the fact that they're citizens, be able to vote?
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, it's always amazing to me that America thinks of itself as this shining city on the hill when, in terms of exporting democracy all across the world. I mean, we rank 31st out of 34 industrialized countries when it comes to voter turnout. And a lot of other places do it very, very differently. A lot of other countries automatically register you to vote, as you mentioned. A lot of other countries send everyone an ID if it's needed. So there's no problems with ID. In Australia, they have compulsory voting. It's not a right, it's not a privilege, it's just a responsibility. Right. If you live in Australia, you go vote. And they don't have voter suppression in Australia because everybody is voting. It's just part of the fabric of their society. But I think this automatic registration piece is really important because 10 states have now implemented automatic registration laws. And that's really, really important because a quarter of Americans still aren't even registered to vote. People don't realize that. A quarter of the potential electorate just completely sat out the last election. They weren't registered, they weren't part of the debates, they weren't polled, it was like they were invisible. 60 million Americans were just invisible in the last campaign. And we know from social science literature, these non-voters, they're more likely to be progressive, they're more likely to be lower income, they're more likely to be people of color. If they participated in democracy, then it would lead to better policy outcomes. But they're not participating for one reason or another. And when states have made it easier to vote, more people actually do vote. So I mean, it makes sense from a common sense standpoint, but it's also empirically true. So Oregon became the first state to pass automatic voter registration in 2016. Oregon saw the largest increase in voter turnout in the last election. And it wasn't a swing state, didn't have a competitive Senate race. There were a whole lot of states, whether it was Wisconsin or Virginia, or Iowa, that were a whole lot more competitive and targeted than Oregon. But Oregon had the biggest increase. Oregon automatically registers you to vote. Oregon sends every voter a ballot in the mail. And that's the kind of thing we could be doing. And so we have the know-how technologically to do this kind of thing. We have the know-how to automatically register you to vote. We have the know-how to send every registered voter a ballot. We have the know-how, we could put polling places at every school, so there's not 3-hour lines to vote. We could do all these things, but we're choosing not to do them for political reasons. And I think a lot of other countries view elections as the kind of thing where there's a broad consensus in terms of you want as many people to vote as possible. We don't think of it that way here, unfortunately. And so every single election cycle, we have these battles about who can and can't participate. And that's a very unfortunate part of our country's history that still continues today.
So we're going to have to stop there, regretfully. Ari Berman, thank you so much.
Great to see you, Bob. Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. We've seen the horrendous destruction wrought by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, the wind damage and the flooding, and the tragic loss of life. Much of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana were devastated by the flooding from Hurricane Harvey, which caused upwards of $180 billion in damage in Texas alone. That's more damage than was caused by Hurricane Katrina. Meanwhile, large swaths of the Caribbean are in ruins following the catastrophic 1-2 punch of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. At least 10 people were killed in Puerto Rico, and the entire island was left without power. These raging, catastrophically destructive storms have long been predicted by scientists who have been trying for years to warn us about the terrible effects of climate change, the warming of the Earth due in large part to the astonishing amounts of greenhouse gases that we insist on spewing into the atmosphere. We're still not paying proper attention. We're like a patient who has been diagnosed with a terrible form of cancer, but remains in denial and refuses to seek any sort of treatment. The willful denial of the Trump administration is not just bizarre, it's unforgivable. The New York Times recently noted that the president's budget proposed eliminating $250 million from the coastal research programs designed to prepare local communities for rising seas and worsening storms. The Times also reported that at the Environmental Protection Agency, a former Trump campaign assistant named John Conkus wants to completely eliminate use of the term climate change from the agency's research grant solicitations. He wants to get rid of the term altogether, pretend there's no such thing. For the most part, we seem intent as a society to ignore all the warning signs and all the alarms until it's too late. That's all for now. See you next time.